The Senate chamber buzzed with a low murmur, the kind that rises before a storm. Cameras clicked in the gallery, journalists leaning forward, sensing that today's hearing would be more than routine political theater. Senator John Kennedy sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, his pen tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm. His gaze never left Senator Bernie Sanders, who was leafing through a thick stack of papers like a man preparing for a sermon. For weeks, Sanders had been promoting his latest sweeping economic reform bill, a proposal loaded with trillion-dollar spending, tax hikes, and a heavy-handed dose of government intervention. The bill had been embraced by progressives as a moral crusade, but Kennedy saw it differently. To him, it was economic malpractice dressed up as compassion, and today, he was ready to make that point with surgical precision. The gavel fell. "The committee will come to order," the chairwoman announced, her voice trying to command attention over the chatter. Sanders began, his tone equal parts righteous and urgent. "This bill is about fairness. It's about dignity. It's about ensuring that every American—" Kennedy leaned forward, cutting him off with a drawl that carried just enough steel to silence the room. "Senator Sanders, before we get into lofty slogans, can we talk about math?" A ripple of laughter and surprise swept through the chamber. Sanders' jaw tightened, but he gestured for Kennedy to continue. Kennedy slid a printed chart across the table. "This here," he said, tapping the paper, "is what your plan costs, trillions we don't have. And unless Vermont's got an oil field I don't know about, somebody's gonna have to pay for it. That somebody is the American taxpayer." Sanders bristled. "We pay for it the way every civilized country does, through fair taxation." Kennedy smiled thinly. "Fair? You're taking a sledgehammer to the middle class and calling it carpentry." The tension snapped tight. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters scribbled faster. This wasn't just going to be a policy debate, it was about to become a demolition. Sanders adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing as if Kennedy's words had crossed an invisible line. "Senator," he said slowly, "what you call a sledgehammer, I call justice. The wealthiest 1% have hoarded this nation's prosperity for decades while working families struggle. This bill is about restoring balance." Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, the corners of his mouth twitching as though he'd just heard the setup to a bad joke. "Balance? Senator, with all due respect, if you think draining the bank accounts of the people who actually create jobs is balance, then I reckon your scales are broken." A few chuckles broke out from the gallery. Sanders' grip tightened on his papers, the tendons in his hand visible. "The richest should contribute their fair share. The average CEO makes 400 times more than the average worker. You're defending greed, Senator Kennedy, plain and simple." Kennedy's eyes lit with a spark that signaled he was done playing defense. "Greed? I'll tell you what greed is, Senator. Greed is politicians spending other people's money like it's monopoly cash, because they know they'll never have to pay it back. You call it helping the people. I call it buying votes with money that doesn't exist." The audience let out a collective, "Oh," the kind usually reserved for a basketball court after a vicious dunk. Sanders leaned forward, voice rising. "You think helping people is buying votes? Tell that to the mother who can't afford insulin for her child." Kennedy's tone dropped low, calm but laced with fire. "I'll tell her the truth, that politicians like you have been promising her the moon for 50 years and delivered nothing but debt. You've convinced her salvation comes from Washington, when in reality, all you're selling is dependency." The room seemed to shrink as both men locked eyes, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. This wasn't just a clash of policies, it was a full-blown ideological war playing out in real time, and neither man looked ready to blink. The chairwoman tapped her gavel for order, but the room only tightened, a coiled spring waiting for release. Kennedy slid another sheet across the table, columns, arrows, and big numbers circled in red. He didn't need a projector, the camera lenses would do the magnifying for him. "Senator Sanders," he said, voice smooth, "your plan promises free this and free that. But nothing's free. Somebody pays. So let's quit the poetry and do arithmetic." He pointed to a fat figure on the page. "New entitlements, permanent. New taxes. Temporary, adjustable, to be determined. That's politician speak for, we're gonna hike it again when the math doesn't work. And Senator, the math never works. Sanders bristled. That's not accurate. The revenue comes from those who can afford to move. Kennedy cut in, polite as a pastor, sharp as a scalpel. High earners don't sit still when you put a bullseye on their forehead. They relocate capital, they delay investment, they trim payroll. You don't punish the rich, you kneecap the middle class. And then you call it compassion. A low rumble rolled through the gallery. Kennedy kept going, pacing the cadence like a boxer who knows he's got reach. You say this bill lowers costs. For who? The federal line item grows like kudzu. Prices don't fall because you passed a law, they fall because supply increases and productivity rises. You can subsidize demand till the bayous flood, but if the shelves are empty, you just printed money to chase fewer goods. That's how you get inflation, and we've had a bellyful of that. Sanders leaned in, eyes flaring. You're defending a system that leaves people behind. I'm defending a system that feeds them, Kennedy replied, not missing a beat. You think prosperity is a pie the government slices. I think prosperity is an oven the people own. Your bill smashes the oven and hands out crumbs. Phones lit up in the gallery. On social feeds, a hashtag flashed to life, hashtag oven not crumbs. Producers in the back row exchanged looks. This was the clip. Kennedy rested his hands, letting the silence carry the weight. Senator, he said finally, softer now, if your ideas are so sturdy, why do they collapse the minute we stop chanting slogans and start doing math? Sanders opened his mouth, then closed it. The pause landed harder than any speech. The storm had broken, and it was moving in one direction. The silence stretched, thick as Louisiana summer air. Sanders finally pushed his chair back a fraction, as if physical distance could give him rhetorical room. I believe, he began slowly, that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, no one should struggle for healthcare, housing, or education. If that means the wealthy pay more, so be it. Kennedy's brow lifted just enough for the cameras to catch it. Well, Senator, that sounds lovely. Like telling the preacher's daughter she's the prettiest girl in town. But here's the problem, you've written a check the economy can't cash. Your plan is a promise without a plan to pay for it, except to keep ringing the same dinner bell for the same taxpayers until the cows die of exhaustion. Sanders' hands curled on the desk. The wealthy already pay the lion's share, Kennedy interrupted, calm but cutting. You talk like they're freeloaders. The top 1% pays about 40% of all income taxes. And you want them to pay, what, 50? 60? Till they shrug and move their business to Ireland? When they leave, guess who's left holding the bag? Your barber, your plumber, your kid's math teacher. The crowd murmured, a ripple of unease mixed with approval. Kennedy leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low enough that it pulled the room toward him. You sell hope like it's on a shelf, Senator. But hope's not something you redistribute with a vote. It's something people build when they're free to keep the fruits of their work and free from the long arm of Washington picking their pocket to fund a wish list. Sanders shook his head, but Kennedy wasn't finished. And one more thing, your plan assumes trust. Trust that government will spend every penny wisely. With all due respect, sir, Washington can't even fix potholes without turning it into a 3-year study and a $20 million project. You want them running healthcare, housing, and higher ed like they run the DMV? Lord help us. That last line landed like a hammer. Laughter bubbled up in the chamber, sharp, unfiltered, the kind that sticks in the replay. Kennedy sat back, a slow, almost imperceptible smile crossing his face. He knew this exchange would play on every cable loop before the day was done. And in the court of public opinion, sometimes humor was deadlier than outrage. Sanders' jaw tightened, his voice rising just enough to bounce off the chamber walls. You talk about trust, Senator Kennedy, but people already trust the government with their Social Security, their Medicare, their military. You're painting Washington as some shadowy villain, but for millions of Americans, it's the lifeline keeping them afloat. Kennedy didn't flinch. He straightened his papers like he was giving Sanders a moment to hear himself. Then, in that slow Louisiana drawl that could turn a greeting into a verdict, he said, "Senator, Social Security is broke in 12 years if we don't fix it. Medicare is drowning in red ink. And our military, God bless them, has to fight Congress harder than the enemy sometimes just to get the funding they need. If that's your gold standard, I'd hate to see your bronze." A few chuckles escaped from the press gallery. Sanders opened his mouth, but Kennedy kept going, his voice now sharper, more deliberate. "You talk about lifelines like they're free. But every dollar that comes out of Washington first came out of someone's wallet. The difference between you and me is I trust the people to decide how to spend their own money. You trust a bureaucracy that loses $60 billion a year in waste, fraud, and abuse." Sanders tried to cut in, "That's an exaggeration." Kennedy held up a finger, not to silence him, but to draw the cameras. "No, sir. That's from the Government Accountability Office. $60 billion. That's enough to give every teacher in America a $10,000 raise. But instead, it vanishes into the black hole of good intentions and bad accounting." The room buzzed, staffers exchanging looks, reporters scribbling notes like they'd just caught the soundbite of the day. Kennedy's gaze never left Sanders. "You want to expand the same system that leaks like a Louisiana shrimp boat with a hole in it. Senator, you don't patch that by throwing in more cargo, you fix the hole. Until then, the only thing you're saving is the ocean." Sanders leaned back, lips pressed tight, knowing Kennedy's metaphor had already left the chamber and was halfway across the country in tweets, clips, and memes. Kennedy leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on the desk, that casual posture that always seemed to signal trouble for whoever was on the other side. "Senator Sanders," he began, his voice dropping just enough to pull the room in, "let me tell you about a woman named Linda from Baton Rouge. She's 62. Worked her whole life, waitress, school cafeteria, whatever job she could get to keep the lights on. She's got arthritis in both knees, and her doctor says she'll need surgery soon. But here's the thing, she's terrified. Not of the surgery, not of the recovery, but of you and people like you deciding how much of her paycheck she gets to keep until then." The chamber went silent. Even Sanders leaned in slightly, unsure where Kennedy was headed. "She told me, Senator, I can stretch $1. I've been doing it since Jimmy Carter was in office. But I can't stretch it if Washington takes it first. Now, I'm supposed to tell her, 'Don't worry, Linda, Bernie Sanders has a plan for you?' Sir, with respect, the only plan she needs is for the government to get out of her kitchen and stop reaching into her grocery bag before she can." There was a murmur from the back, the kind that starts when people realize they're watching a moment that will live longer than the hearing itself. Kennedy sat back, but his eyes stayed locked on Sanders. "You talk about compassion, Senator. I believe in it, too. But compassion with other people's money isn't compassion, it's a hobby. Linda doesn't need your programs. She needs her freedom. And if you can't trust her with her own money, maybe you shouldn't be trusted with hers." A few in the gallery clapped softly before being shushed. Sanders shook his head, scribbling something on his notes, but the cameras had already caught what they came for: Kennedy, calm as a Sunday sermon, dismantling the moral high ground brick by brick. Sanders adjusted his microphone, his voice carrying that familiar Brooklyn grit. "Senator Kennedy, you make a fine speech, but let me be clear, this isn't about taking away from Linda. It's about making sure Linda doesn't end up with nothing when she's too old or too sick to work. This country has billionaires who could buy small nations while seniors choose between rent and medicine. That's not freedom, that's exploitation." Some in the gallery applauded, and Sanders nodded, sensing momentum. We can talk about freedom all day long, but freedom means nothing if you can't afford to live. What you call government overreach, I call basic human decency. Kennedy didn't flinch. He leaned forward again, that slow smile spreading, the one that always meant trouble. "Senator," he said softly, "I appreciate the sermon, I really do. But you just said freedom means nothing if you can't afford to live. I'd argue the opposite, life means a whole lot less if you can't afford to be free." Sanders' brow furrowed. Kennedy kept going. "You want to take Linda's paycheck now so you can give it back to her later, minus whatever Washington schemes off the top, because you think she can't be trusted to plan for herself. That's not compassion. That's babysitting. And the federal government's the worst babysitter I've ever seen." A ripple of laughter swept the room, but Kennedy wasn't smiling anymore. "Sir, you say billionaires have too much. Fine. Go after them. But don't come for Linda's grocery money in the name of helping her. She doesn't want your charity. She wants her dignity. And the day we start confusing those two is the day this country stops being America." Sanders tried to speak, but the moderator's gavel came down. The moment was frozen in that perfect, dangerous silence, Kennedy's words hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The moderator's gavel echoed, but Sanders leaned in, unwilling to let the moment die. "Senator Kennedy," he said, jabbing a finger toward the table, "you can dress it up with folksy charm all you want, but the truth is, without programs like mine, millions will fall through the cracks. You talk about Linda's dignity, dignity doesn't pay the rent. And if the government doesn't step in, corporations will eat people alive. That's reality." The room hummed with murmurs. Sanders had found his rhythm, his voice rising. "This isn't about taking, this is about giving back what people deserve. If you can't see that, then maybe you're fighting for the wrong side of history." Kennedy didn't blink. He let the words hang for a moment, then leaned toward the mic, his tone dropping into that calm, deliberate register that always meant he was about to strike. "Senator, I've been hearing about the wrong side of history my entire career. Funny thing is, history's never been written by the folks who wanted to run other people's lives for them." Sanders shifted in his chair. Kennedy pressed on. "You talk about corporations eating people alive. I'll tell you what's been chewing through this country for decades: politicians who think Washington can love you better than your own family can. Who think freedom is too dangerous to leave in the hands of regular people. Who think Linda needs you more than she needs her own common sense." A flash of steel crossed his eyes. "And you know what, Senator? I trust Linda a whole lot more than I trust you." The room erupted, half in gasps, half in applause. Cameras clicked, staffers scrambled, and in that instant, the hearing was no longer about policy. It was about the moment one senator turned another's decades-old talking points into rubble on live television. The moderator banged the gavel again, but the noise was drowned out by the wave of chatter rippling through the chamber. Kennedy waited, letting the moment breathe, his eyes fixed on Sanders like a hunter watching his mark. "Senator Sanders," Kennedy began, his voice steady but carrying enough bite to cut through the din, "you've spent a career talking about what the government should do for people. But let me ask you, what has all that talk actually fixed?" Sanders opened his mouth, but Kennedy didn't give him the chance. "Poverty rates? Still here. Homelessness? Worse. Debt? Sky high. You've been selling the same medicine for 40 years, and the patient's only gotten sicker." A ripple of applause broke out. Sanders tried to interject, but Kennedy raised a hand. "I'm not saying you don't care. I'm saying caring isn't the same as curing. And every time you promise the government will solve all our problems, you take a little more freedom out of the hands of the very people you claim to fight for." He leaned forward, his tone sharpening like a blade. "You want to know the truth? The most dangerous thing in America isn't a billionaire. It's a politician who thinks he can spend your money better than you can." The chamber froze. Sanders shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, but Kennedy's gaze never wavered. You call it fairness, Senator. I call it control. And I'll fight it every single time. The crowd broke into cheers, some standing, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Staffers whispered frantically. Reporters were already drafting headlines. In that single, unflinching volley, Kennedy didn't just counter Sanders, he made him look like the relic of an idea whose time had passed. And the cameras caught every second. The moderator's voice trembled slightly as he announced the final round of questions. The chamber was still humming from Kennedy's last strike, but now all eyes were locked on him, waiting for the closing blow. Kennedy didn't rush. He adjusted his glasses, glanced briefly at his notes, then looked straight at Sanders. The pause was deliberate, it let the tension coil tighter. Senator Sanders, he said slowly, I don't doubt your passion. I don't doubt you believe every word you say. But good intentions without results aren't leadership, they're false hope. Sanders shifted, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Kennedy's tone deepened. You've promised the moon for decades. Free this, free that. But nothing is free. Someone pays. And it's always the hardworking men and women you claim to protect. You call it progress. I call it picking pockets with a smile. A low murmur swept the room. Kennedy's voice cut through it like a knife. You talk about equality, but the only thing your policies guarantee is equal misery. And I will not stand by while another generation gets chained to Washington's empty promises. The applause began, first a few scattered claps, then a rising wave. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, not gloating, just resolute. This isn't about left or right, he finished. It's about truth. And the truth is, America doesn't need more dependency, it needs more freedom. That's what I'll fight for. Every day. Every time. The chamber erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled to file breaking news. Sanders sat back, his expression tight, the sting of the words hanging in the air. Kennedy had done more than win the exchange, he'd made it a moment. The kind of clip that would be replayed, dissected, and shared across every screen in America. Folks, what you just witnessed wasn't just a debate, it was a reality check. Senator Sanders came armed with decades of talking points, but talking points don't put food on the table or keep the lights on. I didn't come here to trade slogans. I came here to stand for the millions of Americans who work hard, play by the rules, and still get punished by bad policy. Freedom isn't handed out by the government, it's earned by the people. If we keep chasing the same empty promises, we'll keep getting the same broken results. I won't let that happen. Not on my watch. This fight isn't about politics, it's about protecting the future. And I'll be right here, every single day, making sure Washington remembers who it's supposed to work for, you.